grab the fuel nozzle and get ready to fuel up on trends and strategies to grow your travel center business in this episode of the Truckstops Here, brought to you by NATSO. Now, here's your host, Amy Toner.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Truckstops Here. I'm your host, Amy Toner. You are listening to the Truckstops Here, NATSO's podcast. NATSO is the National Trade Association for Truckstops, and our mission is to advance the success of truck stops and travel centers, and this podcast is just one of the many ways we do it. Today, we are joined by NATSO President and CEO Lisa Mullings. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
And David Fialkov, NATSO's Vice President, Government Relations, Legislative, and Regulatory Counsel. Hello, David. Hi there. A lot is going on this year legislatively, so we thought it was important to have you guys on to talk about what the industry can expect. So let's start with the Biden administration. What can truck stops expect? David, we'll go with you.
So I think they, I wouldn't just view the Biden administration alone. I view the Biden administration in conjunction with now full Democratic control of Congress. And I think that we can expect the Biden administration and their Democratic colleagues in Congress to be pretty aggressive on all manner of things. Some of that stuff can be beneficial for our industry. If they pursue vibrant additional incentives for things like biodiesel, that has tended to work well for us. At the same time, they're looking at a number of kind of misguided policies surrounding potentially environmental issues and electric vehicle charging, as well as labor policies. There's a lot of talk about a rapid uptick in the minimum wage. And that could create real complexities for a lot of people. So I think that they're going to be aggressive. I think they're going to move quick. And I think we need to try and harness that momentum in a way that's positive rather than negative for us.
One thing that the elections have really focused on, and I mean, leading up to the elections, has been how bipartisanship is becoming more and more scarce. David, would you say that the election from this year is going to further exacerbate that, or is that something that will be on the mend now with Biden in the White House and the way that the Congress is made up of? Mostly, obviously, Democrats are in charge, but there's, they have a very slim majority in both the House and the Senate.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. And so undoubtedly, it's hard to imagine partisanship getting much worse from where we are, or at least where we were, I guess, at the end of the Trump administration. And I think Biden, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, and whether he actually lives up to his kind of promises with respect to bipartisanship, I think he is more comfortable in a bipartisan environment than in a partisan one. I don't think that was necessarily true about President Trump. So in that respect, I think that there should be at least some movement toward bipartisanship. And also, you got to look at the fact that Democrats, even though they control the House and control the Senate, they have very slim margins, right? And although Democrats generally are aligned with one another, there's a difference between, a Bernie Sanders from Vermont and a Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Even though they're both Democrats, Joe Manchin is a lot closer to a Republican than a lot of people kind of assume. So anything that gets through the Senate, because, it's such a slim margin of victory for Democrats there, is going to need the support of both of them. So it's hard to imagine an exceedingly progressive kind of fire-breathing agenda making its way through, given those dynamics.
One thing that I think is really interesting is how, if members of Congress are looking for ways in which they can get their legislation passed, it's by getting things that are joint bills, jointly introduced by, bipartisan basis. So 70% of the bills and joint resolutions that were enacted in the last Congress were 70% of those were by both Democrat and Republican joint introduction. And but only about a third of the bills that are introduced in the House and the Senate are actually introduced in a bipartisan fashion. So even though so few bills are introduced in a bipartisan fashion, 70% of them are the ones, that's what's getting enacted. So, and that's a lot different story than we used to have. Say 15 years ago, I think it was about 40% of the bills that were enacted were on a bipartisan basis. So I think that issue will continue to be important. And if members are hoping to get things done, then they'll look for a bipartisan solution.
Okay. Is NATSO making any changes to our legislative priorities this year? David?
So we didn't make a lot of changes from this year to last year, but at the same time, I think given the shifting political dynamics, we have to approach our issues somewhat differently. In other words, in previous years, we have, for example, one of our top issues is maintaining the current ban on commercializing rest areas on the interstate. In previous years, when Republicans are in charge, we tend to try and talk about the anti-competitive nature of kind of the government selecting one entity that can have that kind of preferential real estate and undermining the off-highway competition that exists. With Democrats, our exposure is much more in the environmental realm, where a lot of folks are trying to put EV charging stations at interstate rest areas. So we're still talking about the same underlying issue, but we're having fundamentally different conversations about it. And I think that's going to apply across the board, just given the altering political dynamic. The one thing I will say is that something that we didn't work on last year, or at least we didn't talk about last year when we set the agenda in kind of a pre-COVID age, were all of the kind of new policy issues that pop up surrounding COVID, whether it's the Paycheck Protection Program or liability issues for essential industries, or making sure that our industry is declared essential to begin with. So those are now kind of new issues that we're going to need to be focused on that we haven't previously, but hopefully that's going to be of a temporary duration, and that by this time next year, the pandemic will be behind us and we can continue focusing on our kind of core, more bread and butter issues.
So I know this February right now, NATSO members are meeting with their members of Congress. What do you think is most important for these new legislators to know about the industry?
Well, one thing that I hope our legislators will know is how critical our industry is to the efficient movement of goods throughout the country. Truck drivers depend on truck stops as their home away from home. This is the place where they eat, where they fuel, where they park to rest, where they shower. So it is really essential that our members get their team players vaccinated and make sure that they are there to serve the truck drivers that are delivering all of the critical goods to places throughout the country. So that's top of the list.
Yeah, educating these new members of Congress, a lot of them come in without having given a lot of thought to our industry. You would be surprised at how many people kind of think that the major oil brands own the outlets where they have a big price sign out front. So just educating them on the fact that most of our industry is comprised of small businesses. And that we can be very useful if we are extraordinarily attuned to and responsive to our customers' demands. So to the extent policymakers want customers to gravitate toward new things, whether that's electric vehicles or other kind of clean fuels, whether it's more healthy foods, we are able to be a critical source of information for them. To kind of develop policies that we think will move people in the right direction. I would also say that there's been a much more turnover in Congress over the last decade than there has been historically, which means that even if you're a new member of Congress now, if the trends keep moving the way they have been, within a couple of election cycles, suddenly these people are going to be much higher up on the seniority chain. So it's important to get to know them now. You want to buy young, with just like a stock. You want to buy low and sell high. So with a lawmaker, you want to get to know them right when they're coming in and looking for friends. That way, they think of you as they kind of accumulate more power and clout in Washington.
Okay. I selfishly asked this question because I'm just curious. What would you guys say you're most proud of for achieving for the industry in 2020?
I think, without a doubt, getting our members early on designated as essential businesses. There were, quite a few instances where we had, team members of a truck stop that couldn't get to work without having something that said that they were essential workers because they lived, across the state border. And I think it highlighted the importance of the work that our members do every day. So I think from my perspective, that was possibly the most important thing last year. What do you think, Dave?
I think that's that may be one of the most important things that we've done in much longer than that, right? I mean, because it's hard to overstate how, for all of the problems that we had as an industry, particularly in kind of the opening few weeks and months of the pandemic, the fact that we were so soon out the gate in terms of being declared essential really allowed us to focus on issues that assumed we were going to remain open and operating and continue to keep people employed and keep the truckers on the move. If we had to spend our time fighting about whether we were even permitted to remain open, it would have made it all the more difficult for us to kind of focus our attention on some of these other issues that were necessary in order to allow us to remain kind of operational once we know that we're permitted to be. So a lot of folks spent most of last year trying to be declared essential in different kind of localities throughout the country so that they could remain open. So the fact that we were able to do that so soon was critical.
One more question. I hate to end on a downer note, but what do you think the biggest challenge is legislatively in the next few years?
There's been a lot of discussion about EVs and, making sure that our members have a seat at the table when we're talking about the future of fuels, I think is one thing that we've really got to be focused on. We've heard a lot about EVs just since the Biden administration began its work this year. And I think NATSO and other fuel retailers have to be part of the conversation because we're in the best position to provide new technologies, new ways of fueling. We're everywhere. And so it makes sense to engage us and make sure that there's solutions that really make sense for the private sector to adopt quickly.
No, I would say that policymakers are going to be thinking about ways to put their thumb on the scale so that our industry can kind of gravitate away from liquid fuel toward electricity. And we obviously want to make sure, that environmentally friendly liquid fuels have a role to play. And B, equally importantly, we need to make sure that whatever the fuel is, right? We generally have been a fuel agnostic association. Whatever our customers want to buy, we want to be able to sell them. We just need to make sure that whatever the kind of underlying market and regulatory regime governing these different fuels is, it will result in customers who are looking for transportation fuel at the lowest price to gravitate toward the real estate that we already own.
Yeah, and in a way, doesn't that make us, we're representing the consumer, right? Because we're focused also on making sure that we can offer it at the lowest price. And so that's important for adoption as well, making sure that we have the infrastructure in place, but actually what that infrastructure should be, and how it is going to be provided to the consumer at the best price.
Yeah, we've done well with lawmakers functioning as a surrogate for the consumer, right? And a lot of the fuel policy fights we've had have been really fights over market share between, say, oil and biofuel industries, right? And our whole position has been, we don't really care. We just know what the consumer wants, and they want the lowest cost fuel. So we have been basically advocating for policies that would result in less expensive fuel and operating within kind of more efficient markets. And that's something that I think not a lot of people, it's very easy to say we want 500,000 electric vehicle chargers over the next 5 years. Anyone can have that aspiration or that objective, but it takes a level of thought to think about how to place those. What else beyond charging are customers going to want, right? They're not going to want to charge in a parking lot without any amenities or food or restrooms and things like that. They want basically what we're already giving them. So to the extent our industry can be viewed as an asset rather than an obstacle, I think it would be in everyone's interest.
Awesome.
Definitely have our work cut out for us this year, don't we?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast, Lisa and David.
Thanks, Amy. It was a pleasure. Thank
you for inviting us, Amy.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Truck Stops Here. You can find us online at the truckstopshere.show. You can listen to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher. If you have any questions about the podcast or for the podcast, we hope you'll reach out to editor@natso.com. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
The Truck Stops Here was brought to you by NATSO, the association representing truck stops and travel centers. Visit natso.com for more information. The Truck Stops Here is produced by NATSO in collaboration with Human Factor. Producers are Amy Toner and Darren Schulte.